I think we're living at a time in the world where we're all going to be challenged in more ways to dig deep, to find resilience within ourselves and to build that resilience in the teams around us.
So we just wrapped up the first episode with Dean Norhia, and I am so excited that this is the first podcast that's coming out, because a funny story about the show is that I actually interviewed Dean Norhia when I was a graduate student at Harvard Business School in 2019. I started a podcast there questioning capitalism, and I went to, no irony intended, but I went to Harvard to question it, and he was very willing to be my first guest. That first show with him was actually very nerve-wracking. I was interrupting him a lot. I was nervous. I was fumbling my way through the conversation. This time I find myself, especially because we've cultivated a wonderful friendship over the years, I found myself more relaxed. And I found myself really enjoying the conversation as opposed to worrying about what the next question was. And so on this first episode, I hope you'll get a sense of my perception of what Dean Norhia's secret is, which is he is a fundamentally generous soul. I find him to be one of the most generous people, not just with his time, but the way he thinks about sharing wisdom. And I think that comes from a story that he'll share on the show, which I hope you'll pick up on. And I find that concept of generosity is such a powerful one for us to mull on in a world where so much of life is give and take, in a world where so much of existence is what do you get for what you're giving. I do think this world benefits from more generous leaders, and I found myself learning quite a bit just observing Dean Norhia. I should note that he was the former dean. He'd been around for just over a decade, and he passed the torch since. I hope you enjoy. And again, if you like what you're hearing, please give us a follow, a like, or a share. We're the Resilient Leadership Podcast, brought to you by Mandala for us. Well, Dean Norhia, I'm so grateful that you're taking the time to be here with us. You are our first guest of the Resilient Leadership Podcast, and I feel so lucky to have you. So welcome, and thank you for being here.
Really a privilege to spend this time with you, and by God, I'm lucky I'm going to be your first guest.
Yeah, I was listening to, in preparation for this, I was listening to a podcast that we had done together when I was in business school. And at that time, the focus was on capitalism. And I started off by asking about your origin story. And you shared some incredible gems about your favorite book, which was The Good Earth, by the way, if you remember. You shared a lot of good stuff around growing up in India. Today, I want to go back to the origin story with you, but from the different lens of how did the people you grew up with shape your values? I want to start off by asking, if you're open to it, to telling us a little bit about your grandfather, who I understand was somewhat of a meaningful person in your life and had offered a few notes of wisdom around generosity. So if you don't mind resharing a story around that, would love to hear a little bit about him.
So, I grew up in that generation in India where all vacations were spent with your grandparents. That was the way in which, that was the definition of a good vacation, was that your parents sent you to spend time with your grandparents. And I was especially close to my grandparents because when I was only 6 months old, my mother actually went with my father to spend some time in Holland and had left me with my grandparents for a period of time. So in some ways, at least for 6 months of my life, I was even brought up by my grandparents. So I'd had a special affection for that household. But they lived in Mumbai, and during my years growing up, I was at that time living in Delhi. So I would come to Mumbai and spend time with my grandparents. And my grandfather was the tallest man at that time I knew. He was 6 feet tall in a family of which everybody else barely crossed 5'6". So he was a towering man in many ways. In the US, 6 feet is not very tall, but in India, he looked like he was a giant of a man. But he was an engineer. He was one of these people who just loved his work. He loved his engineering. So he would go out in the morning, and when he would come home, there was at least a 90% chance that he would bring someone home with him. And it could be one person, it could be 3 people, it could be 5 people, and it could be someone that he met on a bus ride. It could be someone that he just invited from the building on the way up. And so my grandmother used to always have this feeling like she was constantly irritated with him. Like, can't you at least tell me how many people we're going to have for dinner so that I can prepare? He says, always cook a little bit more. And so at some point, he was just unfailingly generous. People would come to dinner. Everybody was fed dinner. If anybody asked him for a loan, whatever he had, he was not a very rich man. anything he had, he would easily give people loans. So my grandmother used to always say to him, like, like people make a fool of you. They always take advantage of your goodness. And why are you so generous with all of these people in all these ways? And I remember once, I was so young, and yet I remember this conversation till today, which is he said, have you ever had less to eat as a result of making food for other people? Uh, have I ever not given you what you need if I've loaned money to other people? And he would stump her with that question because she could never say no. So he would say, well, then be happy. What difference does it make to you if I behave in all of these ways? So at some point, these things happen in people's lives. My grandfather passed away. By that time, my own father had been quite successful, and I had gotten to know very successful people who were successful in the standard ways in which you think about success, right? They had become wealthy, they had gotten important positions, and my grandfather was none of those things. He had never become important or successful in the standard ways in which you would measure success. He did well, but he was not like a successful person in that sense. But nevertheless, we in India, we have this custom where people come to visit you on the fourth day after a person's death. It's on the chotha. And, often you just create some space in your living room, which is what we created to allow people to come to give their respects. At some point, there were just so many people who were coming that we had to move out of the living room, and we had to move into they lived in a building, so we moved down. And at some point it was like, I kid you not, Tarun, thousands of people came that day. And more people came to remember him than I've seen at almost any funeral of the most important people that I've had the opportunity to sometimes then go and visit. And people just came because he'd done some act of little generosity with them. So that's the day I understood that if you live your life with unconditional generosity, which is what he had, he never expected to be paid back. He never expected that someone whom he invited to dinner would necessarily invite him to their house for dinner. So there was no thing. It's just like, I'm going to live my life as a generous person. And I think that it's a wonderful way to live your life. And I have never been able to be as generous as him, but at least I've tried to be as much as I can, channel that in my life. And it's been a much better way to live life.
It's a powerful muse to have, I imagine, especially because you're a teacher first and foremost, right? That's what you've reinforced even with us as people that you've worked with, the students or people that you've gotten to know, and bringing that element of generosity just allows for so much openness and freedom, and just it creates a different world. And I wonder if actually, follow up on that. I think when I'd read was you had just moved to the US when he passed away. So you flew back to India.
Back to India for that moment.
Yeah. I'm curious, as you navigated through the 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s in America, which in many ways is a culture grounded in the power of self-actualization and growing one's influence and one's own power. How do you think that value system, which may have had its roots in Eastern culture, played a role in your own development as a leader here as you were interfacing with the American ethos? Do you see them as different, or do you see some blend, or how do you think those values played together for you?
So I think that what I learned in America, and very early on, I learned, I read Emerson when I came to the US. And it's interesting how I was actually, I think I've shared with you in the past, I was very lucky to have an 8th grade school teacher who made me read extraordinary things, one of the greatest influences in my life. And that's where I read The Good Earth as my first great book that in 8th grade, this teacher encouraged me to read. And I ended up reading through this teacher, in 8th grade, just a large number of Nobel Prize winning authors. And it was my way of traveling the world when I'd never traveled outside of India, from China to Germany through Hermann Hesse. And, it was just an extraordinary tour through the world. And later on in life, I've been very lucky to actually be able to go to all of these places that I only had read about in 8th grade. But I never read Emerson. And so I read Emerson when I came to the US and actually ended up living in Concord for a short period of time too. So it was interesting
Oh,
to
wow.
have to be able to go to Walden Pond and to see the places that
Yeah.
Emerson lived. So there's this book on self-reliance that Emerson wrote about. And even though, at some level, I think even Gandhi preached self-reliance and Emerson was quite inspired by Gandhi. So it's not like these ideas didn't have. But what I took away from self-reliance was that was a uniquely, for me, an American ethos, which is, for me at least, this country taught me that you can believe in yourself, that you are in control as much as anybody else of the opportunities that will come in life to you.
Hmm.
That doesn't mean that I don't want to sound Pollyannish, which is there aren't structural constraints. There are certainly people in the world whose opportunity set is less than the opportunity set of other people. I grew up in India, so I know how different the
Yeah.
opportunity set is that people can have in various ways. But I love that feeling of being in America, that I had a lot more agency in my own life and I could be self-reliant in many ways, all the way from small things. I was vegetarian, so I had to learn how to cook in graduate school. Uh, and I learned cooking by 3-minute trunk calls with my mother in India, because at that time we didn't have cell phones, we didn't have the
Yeah.
internet, we didn't have anything.
FaceTime. Yeah.
Didn't have FaceTime. So literally, and a 3-minute call was all I could afford. So I used to just tell her that today you're going to tell me how to do something. And then I had to experiment and cook in those ways. So it's a small example, but I think being away from India, being away from the support system that I think could have both nurtured me, but in some ways would have always made me feel more reliant upon them.
Yeah.
I love the kind of naked self-reliance that I was forced to embrace in the United States. And very important value system that I felt was not incompatible at all with the generosity that I learned from my grandfather, or the importance of family or community that I learned from other people growing up. But I think adding to that, the sense that you can be the author of your own life was a very important part of what America gave to me very early on in my time here.
Yeah. It seems like that blend they're not incompatible.
Yeah.
Like one can be both generous and self-reliant. And it seems like that's been a defining thing for you.
Yeah.
One of the
I
things,
think that,
one of the,
people say that I'll make a small distinction here, which is I've
yeah,
sometimes said that being self-interested is not the same as being self-centered. Like there's nothing wrong. I mean, every human being in the world has some self-interest, and you want to do better
yeah,
for yourself. You want to do better in your own life, but that doesn't mean you have to become selfish or you can't be generous. You can still want more for yourself, want to be ambitious, want to be an author of your own life,
yeah.
but you don't not want to be generous to others. I mean, why is that incompatible?
Yeah, yeah. I think taken to their extreme, one can imagine that if you stretch the concept of self-reliance to its extreme, you might just feel comfortable just being on your own. And that becomes sort of an individualistic frame within which to view all of life. I think the flip is probably true when you sort of surrender the needs of you have for the needs of a community, stretched to its extreme. It can
Yeah,
almost I think there's something there, but um, one of the terms that I've heard you use before and you use quite often is this idea of a true north. And you ask a lot of people to think about their true north, whether they're leaders of a company or just people in general. Like, how would you describe that for you? Like, what is your true north? Does it change at different stages of your life? Where you're at today, how do you think about that concept, just for yourself?
so I think that some people very early on know what their true north is, and some people discover it sometimes accidentally, sometimes almost by happenstance. And I'm in the latter category. I discovered my true north almost by accident.
Hmm.
If someone had told me when I left India, even to come to graduate school in the United States, that one day I was going to be an academic, I would have died laughing. And most of my friends would have laughed even loud, like nobody pegged me for anything. I would be an entrepreneur. I was just always tinkering. I was starting crazy businesses, most of which failed. T-shirt businesses, a Chinese kitchen in which, like, I mean, you can't, like, the only thing I would say is that I tried half a different businesses when I was in graduate school, and I didn't make money on any one of them. And yet My dream was to be an entrepreneur. I absolutely wanted to be an entrepreneur. But to come to the United States, I needed to get a scholarship. And the only way to get a scholarship at that time was to apply to PhD programs. So I ended up applying to PhD programs because that's what a cousin told me, that, you need a. I thought like 4 years versus 2 years. I was 22. It didn't feel like, it just felt like a good deal. I was trying to be an entrepreneur, even about my PhD program, that I'm going to get an education for free in 4 years. And then a great advisor of mine said to me that being an academic is like being an intellectual entrepreneur. You have to produce a set of ideas that win in a marketplace of ideas. And he says it's not the same as building a company, but if what you care about is being a kind of author or an agent of your own life, then certainly being an academic is quite compatible with that. And that transformed my thinking. But over time, what I learned is that even though my initial attraction into being an academic was to be an intellectual entrepreneur, at Harvard Business School, I learned that my true north was to be a teacher. There's just something about being in an MBA classroom and teaching by the case method where it's such a collaborative process. You're not the expert in the front of the room. You end up being, and I certainly was not. Like, I started at Harvard Business School at age 26. 80% of my class was older than me. Any one of them had more leadership experience than I had in terms of, so collectively, certainly they had a lot more. And here I was teaching them leadership. So it really required me to.
Wait, I have to ask about that. That is fascinating. I didn't internalize that. So you were 26 when you started talking or teaching leadership. Tell me about can you give me a story of a time that stands out to you from that period where you sort of realized where you were? Did you ever have like imposter syndrome or like, do I belong here?
I literally remember, like everybody teaches you at Harvard Business School that you should read all your student class cards before you show up to the first class, right? And I'm reading my student class cards, and there's people who've been 10 years in the army, they've led regiments. There's people who built businesses. Even the investment bankers and consultants had all said that they had small teams that they had overseen. And here I was, I'd never, other than my failed businesses, I had never run anything, right? Like I had gone straight from my undergraduate in chemical engineering to finishing graduate school. I didn't have an MBA. I didn't have any of these things. So I show up in class, and I remember on the first day I said, so how's this going to work? I've read all their class cards, but probably they've read mine too, right? And if they're smart, they've probably put 2 and 2 together and know that they have a rookie teacher who's teaching them leadership and organization behavior without a single day of having had any leadership experience. So I figured that it's just best to be honest. So I stood up on the first day and I said, you might be wondering what I'm doing teaching you this class, because all of you have more leadership experience than I do. But I have spent more time reading about this topic and thinking about it than any of you have. So that's the trade. The trade is that I will do my very best to share with you what I have learned, and I will learn every day from you what you know about the practice of leadership. And I hope together, as a result of that, we will have a great class. And because it was the truth, like that is essentially what I had to learn how to do. And it's amazing how students cut me so much slack by virtue of at least admitting that. And I will readily confess that it took me 3 years to become a decent teacher, but I loved it from the first day. I loved just the opportunity to be in that classroom and to learn from my students. Until today, I have never taught a case in which I haven't learned something from my students, even if I've taught it for the 20th time. Because maybe it became just a part of my habit from the first day that I knew that I had to listen and learn from my students if I was ever going to learn enough about leadership. And so till today, I'll teach classes and will inevitably find some student will say something that is important, and it adds to my vocabulary of leadership. And so I've loved teaching. And so now being a teacher in every sense of the word is my true north.
I think there's something so powerful in being able to name it. And I think your story of being 26 and having to teach HBS students, I think there's something resonant for people who maybe graduate and suddenly have to manage, and there's folks that are older than them, or there's people who've never been in a position like that before, or maybe they're the first of their kind to be in that position. And I think there's a learning there around the power of naming without dissolving the skill set and the knowledge that you're bringing to the table, right?
And it's easier, right? Like there's a wonderful book that I read. I think it's called Zen and the Art of Archery, which talks about that the real essence of Zen is to have the beginner's eye. That if you can maintain a beginner's eye throughout your life, it's the only approach to mastery, because that means you approach every day knowing that there's something that you can learn that can make you better at your craft.
Hmm.
I only read this book 2 or 3 years ago, but it almost felt like the book captured how I intuitively had tried to live my life as a teacher, which is to begin every day saying, I know a lot, but this is
Hmm.
learning about leadership is a lifetime's work. And even at the end of that lifetime, I'll barely have scratched the surface on what I can know about leadership. So I think that that's a good mindset probably for everybody to bring to what they do, right? Like however experienced you are and whatever you do, at some deep level, you're still a beginner at your craft.
What do you think gets in the way for people to actually do that? I mean, you've studied leaders of all kinds. You've maybe probably been one version of this where you didn't walk in with that approach. I'm curious to know, like, what do you think gets in the way for a leader to touch base with their humility before they enter a scenario?
I mean, it's just easy, right? Like people tell you you're so good, you're so great, and especially as you get more accomplished, you're surrounded with that sound more than you're surrounded with the sound of, which is what they might say privately, which is, oh my God, the guy knows nothing, which people often say, but they never say to you at your face. But you should always remember that just by definition, one of the things that was, at least for me, a powerful recognition is that unless you're arrogant beyond belief, 90 people in any classroom cumulatively always have far more intelligence than you can possibly have. It's just mathematically impossible, so you just have to literally just think of it as a simple mathematical theorem, and it just has to be true that any 90 people will be collectively smarter than you. So if that's true, it's probably true of any 6 people around a table too, right? So if you stay a standard team that you might work with, an executive team, or any group of people that you might work with, there's going to be 6 or 7 people. The reality is that cumulatively, those 6 or 7 people will always know more than you about anything that is the matter at hand. And your job should be to try and extract as much as you can. And I think that it is rare for us, again, if we're being humble, to ever feel that we've truly extracted the full benefit of a team, right? Like almost all conversations will be like, even this conversation that you and I are having, we may learn something from each other, but we've probably left a lot more unlearned than we even learned from each other in this conversation. I mean, just by definition, that's likely to be true. There's many threads that we will not pursue. There's many things that you are thinking of that just given time, politeness, all these things, we may not just have a plumb.
Yeah. I mean, there's such a depth to your awareness around this, right? I feel that I want to actually, we could go deeper into the leadership thread, but I want to your point, there's one thread that I don't want to leave hanging, which is I want to go back to 26-year-old Nitin Nohria, recently appointed professor at HBS, who is maybe away from his family. Were you married then? Remind me, I don't remember the
I just
clock,
got
the
married.
timing.
So I got married a year and a half before I started teaching. So I was married at that time.
Yeah. And you and your wife were living in Boston, Cambridge, and you were recent immigrants. It sounds like both of you were making sense out of this world. Tell us about that time. What was it like to be an immigrant, a couple decades back, where you're figuring out both your career, but also figuring out how to build a life here? Your whole family's back in India. I want to know more about what a day in that world was like for you then.
First, like, this is going to sound corny, but both Monica and I almost felt like we had to pinch ourselves because, on the one hand, it was scary as hell to be 26 years old in front of a classroom at Harvard Business School. On the other hand, oh my God, I'm at Harvard Business School. Can you believe it? Like how extraordinary is that? Like, for a kid growing up in India who did not even have the courage to apply to Harvard Business School when I was applying to graduate school, I applied to MIT because I said, "Oh, I'm from IIT, so at least there's two things in common. Two words are in common, IT. So at least that might be,
IT, yeah.
Institute of Technology, and they might perhaps pay a little bit more attention to me." So coming to Harvard Business School was like, oh my. And my wife Monica at that time had gotten a job at Digital Equipment Corporation. And today nobody might remember Digital Equipment Corporation, but in 1984 this had been the most admired company in the United States 5 years in a row. So here we were
Mm,
both in jobs that we could never have imagined we would have gotten. So on the one hand, there's the exhilaration of these jobs, and on the other hand, it's like, are we going to are we going to measure up to them? Like, will anybody think that we're good enough to have these jobs for long periods of time? So I remember my first contract at Harvard Business School was for 3 years, renewable for 2 more years. And I'm not trying to be pretend humble, but if someone had given me the over under on whether I would have lasted those 3 years and gotten a extension on my, I would have said no, and I would have said, and I would have still been happy. Like, how can you go wrong with having at least 3 years of Harvard Business School on your resume? Like, that's literally what our mindset was, right? Like, we
mm,
got these great starts, and if we're lucky, it will continue, and if not, we still got these great starts, and it'll lead to new opportunities that will be equally interesting. So there was both a sense of exhilaration, but frankly, every day a sense of, can we measure up to these opportunities that we have gotten?
And on a day-to-day basis, how did you internally meet that voice that was maybe questioning whether you could meet that need? Do you
I
remember
think
what you were thinking?
for
Or
us, it was like heads down, work hard. There's no other way to describe it, and I maybe that's just the immigrant mentality, which is we've been given these amazing opportunities, and all we control is our effort.
yeah,
There's nothing else that we have control over, and so at least what we're not going to do is leave effort on the table. Like, we're going to put
yeah,
as much effort as we can into these jobs. We worked hard and long. We both agreed, because we were young, we had gotten married very young, that we didn't need to have children early. So we decided to
mm,
do everything we can to at least have the first 3 or 4 years of a career in which our careers would have singular focus as our effort.
mm,
We, from the earliest days, felt that vacations would be the way in which both Monica and I had never, we had come to the US for the first time after never having traveled anywhere outside of India till we came to graduate school. So we used traveling abroad at that time as the gift to ourselves for having had
mm,
this opportunity to work hard.
mm.
That was all we needed for the first few years. Was we've been given these
Yeah,
amazing opportunities. We're going to put damn everything we know how into it, and
yeah.
we're going to allow ourselves this little joy of going for 2 weeks of
Mm.
vacation, but everything else is just going to be
Do,
full
do the two
focus.
of you ever do the two of you ever consider the way your journeys unfolded? Like, I know she also became a high-powered exec at worked at Fidelity and a number of other places, and for you, obviously, do you ever look back and you're like, wow, those two people who came to this country, what they've evolved into? I wonder how you guys
But,
reflect on that.
we tell these stories to our children who roll their eyes because they certainly didn't have
Mm,
this opportunity. But it's interesting how things in your life uh, become seared memories of these early days. So I remember Monica
mm,
putting a quarter into a Coke machine at the time, and that's what it used
mm,
to take. And the Coke machine didn't deliver the quarter, that didn't deliver the Coke, and she cried. I
mm,
mean, like, losing a quarter in a Coke machine without getting a Coke was a real thing. We didn't go to see movies in a movie theater. MIT used to have these movies where you could go to see a movie for $1, and they used to
mm,
be, you know, 1 month old. But hey, waiting for a month and seeing a movie for $1 was better than paying $5.50 to go to see a movie.
mm.
And we didn't think twice about it. It's like now, we tell these stories today because they seem quaint, but at that time, it
It
wasn't
was
even
just
really
what it
story.
was.
It was just that's the way it was. So today we tell the
Yeah.
story because we're trying to actually impress some value upon our children and all of the shit. But the reality at that time was that we weren't like trying to be brave or like
Yeah.
anything. We were just like,
You were just
that's,
being. You were just being.
yeah,
Yeah,
we
you
were
were
just,
being.
that's just the way it was.
You're hinting at this topic. I want to go deeper into it. It feels like when I read your resume or read your career story since that 3-year contract that you had with HBS, from an outsider's perspective, it feels like a continuous flow of writing books, authoring thought papers, case studies, and building a sort of steady stream of success after success to eventually where you were appointed dean of HBS. I want to know if you had any experiences similar to the t-shirt business while you were climbing and while you were working at HBS. If there are any moments of professional stumbles or failures that stand out to you. Let me hear the Dean Norhia failure resume. I want to hear that.
That list is even longer than the number of businesses I failed at in my time as an undergraduate budding entrepreneur. One of the most important things that you have to do early in your career is to publish a paper from your thesis. It's almost like a necessary badge of, like, if you can't publish a thesis paper, then what are the odds that you're going to end up having a great academic career? And my first time I submitted my thesis paper, it came back with a rejection from the journal that I submitted it to. And so now my second year is coming to an end at Harvard Business School, and I still don't have my thesis paper published. And it feels like this is the end, right? Like the 3-year contract, I don't have my thesis paper published. Happily gotten another paper which was not from my thesis published. So at least I had a little bit of comfort that I was not an unpublished author by the time of my year. But it was still like a big thing. And so, in the dead of winter, I decided to do, what felt like the stereotypical authorly thing. I rented a home in Nantucket in the middle of winter because it was so cheap to rent a home in Nantucket in the middle of winter. And I said, I'm just going to go away and I'm going to rewrite this paper. And I rewrote the paper, and the paper yet didn't get published. So it's like, and I, in the end, never got my thesis published in an academic journal. I had to publish it as a book chapter. In the meantime, I got many other things published, and life turned out to be good. But that's just one example of how there's lots and lots of, I could share with you many more, but that's just an illustration of the number of ways in which at each stage you face some failure, you face some success, and you have to hope that your successes will overweight your failures. And in some ways, your successes can be surprising, and your failures can be things that you really hope that you would be successful on. So I feel, it was one step ahead of the next sometimes, and happily turned out to be 2 steps forward for 1 step back, but there were many steps back along the way.
Yeah. You don't have to share the specific situation, but if there's one that comes to mind that stings when you think about it, because it was a difficult moment in time, I want to narrow in on that, because I wonder how you resourced yourself to keep going. If there's none that come to mind when I frame it like that, let me know. But I wonder if there's one that stands out to you as sort of a turning point for you personally or professionally.
I think that this one that I was telling you about was probably the most profound such thing. And at some point I had a colleague whom I was working with, and he says, why don't we just write a book together? I was clearly going to be the junior author on that book. Being a junior author on a book and coming up for promotion, a lot of people told me that was an absolute fool's errand, that I needed to, that it would never compensate for my not publishing a solo authored paper from my thesis. And I said, maybe there's another way. Maybe there's another path for me. And I really enjoyed the process of working on this book with Bob Eccles, who turned out to be my mentor and dear colleague. And I still remember when I was coming up for promotion to associate professor, almost everybody said, you should find another job because the odds of your getting promoted are very low. And I did. I found myself another job. I at that time got a second job at McKinsey. I was going to leave and join McKinsey as a consultant, and they were opening an India office. I said, maybe that felt like an exciting thing to do. And I got promoted, but it wasn't it was a tough moment in which I think what allowed me to get through it was, one, in the end, some inner voice that said, as long as you do the things that you love and you can do well. And I really loved working with Bob, and I really enjoyed the process of writing that book. I said, you can't control whether you're going to get promoted or not, but you can at least control the work that you do and enjoy the work that you can do.
Whether you see it as wisdom or not, or if you would phrase it as not that or not, I think there's a number of just ways in which you've framed the world that are just really extractable to other people, right? It seems as though you are sort of relentlessly focused on what you can control and not sort of agonizing over the outcome as much. It seems just from what you're describing that humility and keeping a groundedness to what you do and how you do it helps sort of defray that imposter syndrome that can sometimes capture you without losing your sense of assertion and really who you are. I think like it's almost like there's a shadow that you've casted that offers really simple, thoughtful lessons for people. I like when you work with people now, I know you're on the board of, Tata or Mass General, or you think about serving and giving people advice. Like, what is that like? Do you draw upon these moments? Do you draw upon some of your academic learnings? Do you draw when they ask you for your consultation on a particular problem? How do you think about giving them advice? We'll start off with people you're advising first, and then I want to go to students.
So I'm sure that at some deep level, we're all shaped so much by our own experiences and our own history and how we've accumulated lessons in life that we channel those lessons into what we say to other people, whether we like it or not. I think that that's an inherent bias.
Invariably true. Yeah.
Has to be true, right? Like, I mean, how else? I can't think in ways that are not been shaped by my own experiences and my own learnings. Yeah. So that has to be true. But I'll be honest in saying that I never consciously try to do that. My conscious effort is to always do the best I can to put myself in the place where I'm trying to really listen for what it is that the other person's grappling with. And then from that listening, say what feels true to me in terms of what I believe that I should share with that person. And I've always learned that if you can like marshal whatever it is that I know, but I'm trying to provide, just as I would do in a case method classroom, ask a question or make an observation that is rarely based upon anything that I have thought of in advance of the class, though I do prepare extensively. And so I imagine that some of the things I share come from that preparation or come from the previous classes that I've taught, but I can authentically say that I listen. I'm never thinking ahead too much in a conversation. I'm never thinking about what it is that I should say to you. I've always just tried very hard to stay in the moment of what the person's, or where the class is at, or what a student is saying, and then ask them the question or to reflect back to them what I've heard in a way that would be helpful. And that's what I try to do in almost everything that I do in a boardroom, and advice that I give people is to respond in the moment to what I think is the question or the concern that they have, or the issue that they're dealing with.
Yeah. I mean, it's not like you're taking a formulaic approach or you're just anecdotally thinking about you and your own perspective of the world. You're actually trying to listen.
At times I've been accused by my academic colleagues of saying that, why aren't you more like Clay Christensen? Why aren't you more like Mike Porter? I mean, you have ideas, but you'll never, ever lead with your ideas being the answer to a question. And I don't know, I've just never been motivated to lead with research that I've done or ideas that I have or a point of view that I've developed. I just feel like if I have that point of view, it'll come out in the context of trying to give a genuine response to the person.
If you consider the leaders you've been exposed to, both in the classroom, in the boardroom, in the world at large, tell me, like, big picture, the qualities of what you describe as a resilient leader. What does a resilient leader look like to you? Are there examples of people that come to mind when I ask that question? What do they do? How do they behave?
So I think my own view of this is that the leaders that I have experienced as the most resilient are leaders who are grounded in their own set of values. And so I think their values provide them with this true north, right? Like there's got to be something that makes you say that whatever is happening in the moment, I will see my way through it. And what can you lean on when you have to see your way through it? You can lean on your values and some things that on a daily basis you know how to do that you feel confident in or comfortable with, right? So that's my sense of what I have found the people that I know who I admire as being resilient and especially people who seem to see their way through uh, good times and bad. They seem to be deeply grounded in a set of core values.
One of the things in being value centric, and there's a lot of evidence that now supports the neuroscience based benefits of actually thinking in terms of values as opposed to just reacting all the time. I think there's a level of patience and equanimity that is somewhat required. I was reading an HBR article you published, I think earlier this year, where you had said something like 37% of a leader's time is spent in reacting to the obstacle or the moment. And most people who react to what you described as like siren songs or false alarms almost, there's a desire to respond sometimes so quickly you may ruin the situation because you're maybe not approaching it from a value centrism or a patience or an equanimous approach to things. How does a leader cultivate that in a culture that feels so devoid from being equanimous or patient at times and much more reactive, and think about the influx of social media, much more attentive to every pressing need? How does one actually do that? That's a question I had reading your HBR piece.
It's a great question, and you frame it in a way that I haven't necessarily thought about. I'll just share my own here. I will rely upon my own experience because in my time as dean, there's constantly incomings, right? Like there's articles that are being written about Harvard Business School that are positive articles, but there's equally like many more articles that are almost written about the school that were critical in some way, shape, or form. So what I learned is that you have to, as often as you can, you should not react in the moment. So almost always, if you can find time on your side, time will be your friend. It gives you more time to think. It gives you more time to consult other people. The other thing that I learned is that in my time is I had in the dean's office 2 or 3 people who I would almost immediately just go and bounce something off of. So I learned that if you just think in your own head, you start imagining things. But if you verbalize what you are saying to someone else, you think more clearly. If they know you well, they will say to you, your instincts are dead on. Sometimes they'll say to you, you should think. I'm not sure that makes sense to me. Now, you don't always have that luxury. There are times when you're on a phone with someone and they're angry and you have to give them a response in real time. So it's not like you always have that opportunity, but I think to the extent that you can, if you buy yourself time, you almost always allow yourself to not react emotionally, to react with a little bit more equanimity, to even then build and cultivate that equanimity in yourself, that you don't have to do everything immediately. And if you just learn that over time, I think it just ends up being helpful. But I'm really thinking aloud with you as you're asking the question, Tarun.
Yeah. No, I can hear it. I love it. I think this is the layer that I wanted to touch on. I know we have to close in a minute, but I feel, if I can project back to you, Dean Norhia, as I think some of the wisdom you accrued on a personal level, reading the books you read as a young person, I think teaching the classes the way you did and espousing those values consciously or completely unconsciously, I think have allowed you to build that reservoir of patience. And part of the reason I'm trying to work on what I'm working on is I think if we can cultivate those qualities in leaders and not see it as something you just have or don't have, they can then use your framework and examine what a siren song is and say, all right, I don't think I need to jump in and power through and react right away. So that's partially where it's coming from for me. The interest in this topic is at that level.
I also think that it is really, really important to, now that we're talking, to build around you a support system in which you have some trust. Because if you have a support system around you, which is, other people whom you can turn to, folks you can seek advice from, people who don't make you feel alone. I think while yes, at the end, There is an element of leadership which is lonely, which is you do end up at times being the residual decision maker. So as much advice as I took from people, in the end, I knew that I owned the decision. And if it went badly, I was going to get more blame for it than I probably deserved. If it went well, I was probably going to get infinitely more credit for it than I deserved. So in that sense, you do end up probably taking more ownership and leadership for things. But it helps you a lot to know that you have the support system in place so that you don't feel lonely all the time. And I think that if you don't feel lonely, it's a source of great resilience. And we know that, right? Like we know that even from the work on clinical psychology, that loneliness, feeling like you don't have anybody to talk to, is a cause of depression. It's a cause of so many things that we worry about in modern life. And having lots of voices in your head is not very good either, right? Like, so this is the social media world or the other world in which we today have a cacophony of noises in your head. So having measured voices that you can rely upon and that you feel you can trust on, and having people who will speak the truth to you, even if it pinches, but because they know that you actually welcome that. I think that's one of the best mechanisms that you can build for yourself to help you build resilience and the capacity to navigate the challenges that life inevitably throws at you on a daily basis.
Yeah, I think that's a great closing. And I just want to flash this book. I know we've talked about it before, which is Mandela's book. Like, that's actually what he covers towards the end, which is the community that the Robben Island inmates had, him and his co-conspirators. That was what actually helped them get through. They had value centrism. They had a communal approach. The guards made the mistake of letting them interact with each other, which is the issue, which is the way they compounded their strength over 2-3 decades.
What a wonderful thing. And maybe the way to say that is that don't let your own guards prevent you from developing a community with others.
That's beautiful. That's a beautiful ending. I could go on for an hour or more on just this topic with you. I know that, but I want to close by just thanking you for demonstrating a lot of these qualities and being a good muse for me and for us as we start to build this business and helping leaders become more resilient. So I'm so grateful for our time. And as always, it always feels a little short, which is a good sign. So I appreciate you.
You didn't ask me for this, but I will say that I'm so glad that, given all the choices that you have, that you are focusing on trying to build a business that will help both individuals and teams of individuals develop resilience. I think we're living at a time in the world where we're all going to be challenged in more ways to dig deep, to find resilience within ourselves and to build that resilience in the teams around us. So I think the work that you're doing is timely. It's important. It's probably always been important, but it feels somehow much more important these days. So I wish you the very best, and I hope you're very successful in your endeavors.
Thank you, Dean Norhia. We appreciate you. Thank you so much for listening to the Resilient Leadership Podcast, brought to you by Mandala For Us Incorporated. My name is Tarun Galagali, your host. If you have any questions or if you ever want to reach out and learn more, I'm at Tarun, that's TARUN, at Mandala, MANDALAFORUS.com, mandalaforus.com. So hope you reach out with any questions you may have. This show is brought to you by Mandala For Us Incorporated and is co-produced by Jim Mendes. I hope you enjoy what you're listening to, and as always, if you have questions, feel free to reach out to Tarun at mandalaforus.com. Take care.